starting with the bushfire in Australia and the coronavirus pandemic. The year 2020 has been difficult for many around the world. Things are made even more difficult in the USA under the incompetent, impetuous, and imperialistic Trumpian regime. Trump's lassitude toward the coronavirus lays bare that he values the economy over humanity, while his response to the Black Lives Matter protest demonstrates that he would not hesitate to use the military and religion to reinforce white supremacy. In this time of many deaths and much dread, with many feeling what Du Bois calls not hopelessness but unhopeful, this paper argues that our continual grief and mourning are much more than psychologically cathartic, but can function as a productive force to insist that things could have been different. In the last couple of decades, there's been much scholarly investigation of melancholy or unfinished grief as enabling a politics of mourning, as a politics that people perform rather than repress their disappointments and pain. Unresolved mourning keeps alive and renders memorable the waste and excess that do not fit a plot of progress, but unsettle us with the need to recognize realities that we'd rather forget. Good grief have the potential to haunt us into a sociological imagination of what could have been, and make us aware of unrealized dreams, foreclosed alternatives, or what normative politics see as impossible or impractical. Such a politics, by publicly declaring losses that are not only missing but also missed, helps to keep pushing the question about whose lives count and what losses are grievable. By refusing to let go and enduring politics of grief is not only ethical to keep the dead alive, but also enabling for both the grievers and the lost objects to form new attachments. One scholar even calls those who mourn losses that are forbidden to be grieved by the state as engaging in acts of an insurgent melancholia. In the words of another scholar, we must become tellers of ghost stories, paying attention to what history has rendered ghostly, and write into being the seething presence of the things that appear to be not there. Primarily a symptom of what is missing, a ghost gives notice not only to itself, but also to what it represents. In her book titled Passed On, Carla Holloway discusses how African American mourning and burial practices, in response to Black people's vulnerability to untimely deaths, play a crucial part in the construction of Black identities. Similarly, the gospel writer was passing on a story of a resurrected Jesus to readers after Jesus had already passed on by Roman execution. John's gospel can therefore be read as a form of recalcitrant memory, or even a militant refusal to allow certain objects to disappear into oblivion by colonized people. Let's face it, John's gospel gives a picture of the world that is far from rosy. Grief is a story, and John's gospel is in many ways a story of grief. Its protagonist, Jesus, is presented as the slaughtered Passover lamb. Painting a world full of hatred and death, John's narrative haunts us with its memory of a dead but resurrected and present yet absent Jesus, who makes several ghostly appearances after his crucifixion and resurrection. After appearing to Mary Magdalene, he appears to his disciples in 2 consecutive weeks. The better-known episode is undoubtedly the second one, thanks to the Doubting Thomas tradition. Notice, however, that John Jesus himself, without anyone asking, volunteered to show his hand and his side to his disciples when he appeared to them the first time. So it is not only because of Thomas' doubt that he shows his hand and his side. In his piece about mourning and melancholia, Sigmund Freud suggests that one of the traits of a melancholic is an insistent communicativeness, which finds satisfaction in self-exposure. I've commented elsewhere that John's Jesus seems to suffer from a form of logoria. Not only does he talk a lot, but he also talks a lot about himself. Moreover, Freud writes explicitly about wounds. The melancholic are not ashamed and do not hide themselves, since everything derogatory they say about themselves is a bottom set about somebody else. Homi Bhabha refers to this point by Freud and writes, this inversion of meaning and address in the melancholic discourse, when it incorporates the loss or lack in its own body, displaying its own weeping wounds, is also an act of disincorporating the authority of the master. Fanon said something similar when he suggests that the native wears his psychic wounds on the surface of his skin like an open sore, an eyesore to the colonizer. Referring to Freud's work on melancholy and grief, Judith Butler also wonders about reading certain performances as acting out. John's Jesus in this reading is returning as a colonized victim who bears his scars and wounds to not only protest against the colonizers, but also transfer the feeling of the cross to not only Thomas, but also his other disciples. He performs a show and tell that is similar to Emmett Till's mother, deciding to have an open casket during her son's funeral, so that the world could see what they had done to her child and to pass on the cultural haunting of being African American. Since John's Jesus shows, but makes no overt comment or give any specific remark about his scars and wounds, one may also read this scene in light of what Walter Benham means choreographic pantomime, that registers loss by bringing bodies to the foreground. John's Gospel provides its readers here a frozen-in-time image of Rome's imperial terror and brutality by perpetuating the trauma experienced by John's Jesus as a literary spectacle, more than just authenticating his identity as their crucified, dead, and now risen and living Lord. John's Jesus makes a point to flaunt his scars and wounds to his disciples, so they will, like the beloved disciple, feel them and feel with him the deep traumas of the colonial world under Rome. The open wounds of John's Jesus become infectious. Thomas, as a result, personally and emphatically identifies with John's Jesus as my Lord and my God. These words of identification may take on additional meaning if they are read as an allusion to Psalm 35:23, given that Psalm's imprecatory plea for God to defeat and destroy the enemies of God's own people. The passage functions then to align the feelings of the Gospel's readers with the pain of John's Jesus and against aggression or bloodlust of his assailants. The impression one gets from this scene may become even heavier in light of what follows. First, John's Jesus tells Peter that he will lose his freedom, with the narrator quickly clarifying that John's Jesus is actually referring to his death. Second, through a conversation between Peter and John's Jesus, the narrator seems to explain for his reader the death of the beloved disciple. These messages of death, one after another, testify in a sense to its community's vulnerability to colonial carnage. John's Gospel ends by passing on an ongoing grief to his readers, who are now supposed to carry on the memory of Jesus by testifying, mourning for injuries, death, and loss of John's Jesus, and the transfer of affect and emotion that it entails can result in a political alliance, not only among many Johannine characters, but also among readers of the Gospel. John's open and haunting display of wounds and deaths should therefore be read as a staging of national and colonial grief. It is a staging that repeatedly demands something to be done. This, along with the reminder that mourning could keep alive those what could have been alternatives, would be my unhopeful hope in passing on the haunting past. Perhaps this ancient gospel called John can still help us remember and reimagine with this mourning of a ghostly Jesus figure in these times when most of the world seems to be taken over by not only a pandemic, but also the pandemonium of the US empire.